Now I'm going to turn to recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. First, I'd like to put into the record a white paper which is quite instructive. It's entitled Green Power Superhighways provided by the American Wind Energy Association and the Solar Energy Industries Association. Mr. Chair, if I may.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that. And this white paper does confirm what some of the witnesses talked about, which is that we've got 300,000 megawatts of wind projects waiting in line, essentially, to connect to the grid, and they point out that the lack of transmission capacity is also hindering states' ability to meet multiple renewable energy goals, and it just confirms what several of the witnesses have testified today. I want to ask Mr. Detjen about the greenhouse gas interconnection standard that your proposal has incorporated. It basically would essentially allow federal backstop authority. It would encourage it in relationship to those sources that are low and zero greenhouse gas emitting generators. Could you tell us how you envision that working? And by the way, would it help in at least some sense some of the concern of the Northeast states who don't want to see their offshore wind projects intruded upon by, say, if we can call it dirty sources from far away intruding on their corridor?
Thank you for the question. I think there's a lot of confusion about how a greenhouse gas interconnection standard would work. In the first place, it's an interconnection standard. It doesn't govern what electrons are on the line because, as everybody has pointed out, you can't distinguish between green and brown electrons. But if we are going to provide some additional authority to site and pay for special new transmission lines to benefit renewable energy, let's make sure that the generation that's hooked up to it is not conventional coal. And so what we have suggested is that since you're going to need probably gas to balance renewable energy on these lines, that up to a single cycle gas turbine emission level would be acceptable to connect to these lines, but above that would not. And that seems like a fairly straightforward way to approach that. With regard to the question of competition with local resources, I think what should be important, and I think inevitably would happen if the states are driving this planning process, even on an interconnection-wide basis, is that they take into consideration state policies considering local resources and use delivered prices, as was mentioned on the last panel, as the basis for comparing different resources. I think that's a very straightforward way to make sure that the competition is fair.
I'll ask you what I hope is a rhetorical question, but in the bill that I've introduced, we've tried to preserve the bottom-up planning so that the states and regions really do the planning rather than a cram down from the federal government. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the proposals that we've made?
No, absolutely. And I think that there's been a lot of talk about top-down or federal intervention here, but I think the legislation that you've proposed, Congressman, establishes a mechanisms for states to work collaboratively addressing these regional issues, and that those decisions will be executed with the assistance of FERC, but FERC would only be able to step in if the states are unable to reach a plan.
And could you suggest any other solutions to the concern that the gentleman from Massachusetts expressed about this offshore wind being crowded out, if you will? I perceive that this greenhouse gas interconnection standard would help solve that problem because it would essentially allow the use of the federal backstop authority for clean sources, green sources of energy. And I think that would help solve that problem. Do you agree with that, and is there anything else that you could suggest that would help solve that concern?
Well, I think that a stronger step, which Mr. Miller suggested, would be to have federal intervention on the loading orders for the use of different kinds of resources, I doubt that that would be politically saleable right now. So I think that within the context of what's doable, I think that the approach you've outlined is about as strong as it could be. And I might add that I think that the greenhouse gas standard, to a certain extent over time, gets overtaken by the requirements of the cap and trade legislation, assuming that that's enacted. But I think your legislation reflects that as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your cooperation.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will recognize himself now for a round of questions. Let's go down the line. And each of you could answer yes or no. Do you support giving FERC the authority to modify any transmission plans that are established through bottom-up regional planning processes? Mr. Izzo.
I would not.
You would not. Mr. Joes.
Nor would I.
Okay. Mr. Nipper.
No, sir.
No.
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 I think that if the plans are developed by a broad array of states in the way we're describing, I would agree no.
No. Yes. Mr. Walsh.
Bottoms up is each state brings it up, or how do you envision that?
Regional planning process, yeah, that's agreed to by the state. Should the FERC be able to modify a regionally agreed upon plan?
If the planning process is independent, no. If the planning process is not independent, yes.
Not independent meaning?
That it's influenced by market participants and other political entities. The planning process, to me, being in the,
Even if the state governments agree to it?
I believe that all the transmission within the state that is not regional in nature the state should have as much authority over it as they want. When we develop regional transmission, which is for the good of the region or the good of the country,
Should the FERC be able to override that regional plan agreed upon by the states?
I stand by what I said. If it's done by an independent planning authority, yes. Or I'm saying no, and if it's not, yes.
Mr. Miller?
I think one of the concerns we would have if FERC were involved, that the right of appeal ought to be not only limited to the transmission proposers, but also those with other perspectives. Right now,
Under those circumstances, you would give FERC the authority to modify a transmission plan?
well, I think there are legitimate federal issues with anything involving interstate transmissions. But if you are going to create that, it ought to be equally available to both the proponents and those that have concerns.
Okay. Let me get on the line again. How many of you would support a greenhouse gas interconnection standard of the type proposed by Mr. Inslee? Can we go down and ask how many of you would support that?
I would not, for the simple reason that a greenhouse gas interconnection standard does not speak to existing carbon-intensive generation being able to piggyback.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Joes?
I have to qualify my answer. I'm not 100% sure the specifics of the standard. I haven't read them. I would say we have, of course, standards for interconnecting all kinds of renewable capacity already. I would not be supportive of something that limited the use of the transmission line to certain types of technology, simply because I agree with what's been said earlier that you can't label the electrons.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nipper?
No, sir, we would not support
You would not. Mr. English?
I believe that the bill in itself, and since this is going to be part of the legislation, the bill in itself takes care of that issue. So no.
No. Yeah. Mr. Welsh? I know you do support it, Mr. Welsh.
With my company, we're an independent transmission company. You make the policy, we're going to support the policy.
Mr. Miller?
I think it's an interesting concept when applied to lines that feed into the grid, but unfortunately, the authorities that are being discussed would apply to transmission that's not simply for bringing new generation onto the grid, but for expansion of the grid as a whole.
Okay, thank you.
So I would have to say no.
Okay, and I'll let you answer for the record, Mr. Detchon.
Well, just to touch on these 2 points, we are talking about specially authorized renewable energy transmission lines that would be feeding into the larger grid, not to the larger grid. And I agree with Glenn that if this is attached to H.R. 2454 and enacted, then some of the reason for it goes away. But there's always the possibility that this will become disconnected from that bill. And as a freestanding measure on transmission, we think that a greenhouse gas standard would be important.
How many of you would limit federal authority to only lines that affect renewable electricity that is generated? How many of you would limit federal authority just to that?
I would do quite the opposite, Mr. Chairman. I would limit federal siting authority to lines that affect reliability.
Reliability, okay, thank you. Mr. Jost?
Well, I would limit federal authority as only a backstop provision and rely on local and regional planning as the primary mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nipper?
Assuming, excuse me, sir, assuming the backstop authority, no, we wouldn't limit that.
You would not limit. Okay. Mr. English, would you limit?
And again, backstop.
Okay. Mr. Detra, would you limit it just to renewables?
What I would say is that if we're going to create special new authorities, they ought to be targeted at the problem, which is renewables.
Okay. Mr. Welch?
I would not limit the federal backstop
Okay,
siting
thank
authority.
you. Mr. Miller?
I think we would support limiting it and also respecting the Fourth Circuit opinion that we were involved in.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Izzo, do you support federal backup siting authority for lines for any reason other than reliability?
No, I would not.
Could you talk a little bit about that first map which Mr. Miller put up that showed very rich wind resources along the east coast of the United States, with the exception of some portions of the Great Lakes and out on the west coast? It looks like it has the greatest potential for renewable electricity generation in our country.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman, and as I may have mentioned, we are pursuing a 150 megawatt wind farm, and as you mentioned, we can do that 20 miles out and still be in 140 feet of water. That's not to underestimate the challenges of construction and operations and maintenance costs. But we expect to fully bear the cost of the short-haul transmission and would be opposed to having a nationwide support for a long-haul transmission and be unfairly disadvantaged.
Well, what could happen if we take Mr. Miller's charts? I guess they're not Mr. Miller's charts, they're AEP's maps that have been put together. Is that right, Mr. Miller?
The transmission map is AEP's. We overlaid it on wind and then coal resource maps.
If that transmission plan was implemented, it would bring that transmission line in from the Midwest very close to the East Coast. What impact might that have on your planning for renewable electricity off of the coastline or other parts of New Jersey?
We would stop planning for that.
Why would you stop?
Well, because we would not be able to be competitive with the cost of the wind if it's not burdened by the cost of transmission. So the wind from the Midwest, if it does not face a transmission charge, would be cheaper in that case.
Now, you're up in the Great Lakes, Mr. Jost. Could you talk about that as well in terms of the potential renewables coming in off the Great Lakes and what impact that could have for Michigan, and what could happen if instead power is wheeled in from other parts of the country through federal preemption, federal eminent domain takings?
Right. Well, it's a bit similar, but maybe two aspects to what Mr. Izzo has said. First of all, it's clearly windier in the Dakotas, for example, than it is in Michigan. Michigan has wind resource even on land, but it's not as windy in the Dakotas. So instead of 42% roughly capacity factors, you might see in the range of 30% capacity factor. However, once the cost of transmission to get the power from the Dakotas to Michigan is taken into account, it's cheaper to develop it in Michigan. Now, you mentioned offshore. Michigan does have a very strong offshore wind resource. Unfortunately, offshore is still about twice as expensive to develop than onshore resources. And so when that calculus is taken into account, we think it makes more sense to develop the onshore resources in Michigan first.
Now, you heard the earlier testimony about the problem getting renewable energy resources from the Dakotas over to Minnesota and the blame being laid at the feet of the federal government. In that region, do you believe that is one of the main problems, that otherwise the regions have been able to harmonize their electricity transmission policies in a way that is viewed as fair to all states?
Well, I'm not familiar with specific federal government problems that may have come up in Minnesota. My observation is that the regional planning process has been effective and is a good solution to the problem. I think, as many of us are pointing out, you warp the economics when you start putting effectively free transmission or postage stamp transmission along broad regions, and then you change the economics dramatically, rather than having them compete on a standalone basis.
Now, for our audience, when we say postage stamp, what are you referring to?
Well,
why is the phrase
I said free
postage
transmission.
stamp? Why is the phrase postage stamp used?
Effectively, what a postage stamp rate is, and it's used as an analogy to the federal postal system, where you put a stamp on a letter and you send it anywhere for the same price.
You could send it from the Dakotas to New Jersey for the
Exactly.
same price.
The reality, of course, is the costs are not the same. And when we look at the cost of transmission to move power from west to east, there's a significant cost involved. However, if that cost is ignored and everybody pays the same price regardless of how far it moves, it changes the economics. And yes, Dakota Wind would then be more economic on that basis once the cost of transmission is ignored than Michigan or the East Coast. We don't think that's the right way to look at it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're really trying to accomplish, obviously, in the Waxman-Markey bill is to generate renewable electricity and renewable energy jobs generally in all 50 states. So Mr. Izzo here has a plan to, along with many other people in New Jersey, to generate new renewable energy jobs that help with the employment in his company, but in the state of New Jersey as well. And we don't want to invoke the law of unintended consequences here and have a great revolution, have a standard that's imposed upon New Jersey, and then not have the jobs created in New Jersey, especially if they have the richest renewable energy resource right off their shore. Mr. English.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're making a good point, but I'd also suggest one other thing, that it might make more sense in light of the objective of the legislation, in light of the fact that we're entering into a little different world than we have in the past, that really what we're trying to do here is maximize the amount of renewable energy that we get produced all over this country. Now, the fact of whether it's produced in one state versus another state, as long as it's the most cost-effective way in which we can produce it, and we can, in fact, make use of it all across this nation, I would think would be the ultimate objective. Now, I can understand why some folks may want to look at this very localized and maybe a very parochial thing, but this is a national piece of legislation, and we're trying to achieve a national objective, and the thing that's limiting us to being efficient is this transmission system.
Absolutely. And by the way, we couldn't agree more on this, okay?
So if you're looking at this map and the fact that we're talking about along the coast, and they may have more wind there, then obviously we ought to be looking, that's where we ought to produce it, and we should use that most cost effectively, and that's what we should be the driver and where we go. If we can't do that and we have to do it out in the Dakotas, then fine, do it in the Dakotas. But it shouldn't matter whether it's off the coast of Massachusetts or in the Dakotas, as long as we're meeting the nation's needs, and we're going to have a huge amount of power that is going to be necessary to come from renewable energy if we're going to meet these objectives as outlined in the legislation. And one quick point, I know I've got a home down in South Carolina. It's up on a mountaintop. We got a huge amount of wind up there. But I can assure you, if you try to build a wind generator up on that mountain, you're going to have a lot of people that are going to be they're going to be objecting to it, unlike what you'll find in the Dakotas.
Absolutely. So I think the point that Mr. Izzo is making, and Mr. Joes as well, is that using this postage stamp analogy, it doesn't cost 47 cents to really move a letter from New Jersey to New York City. Okay. Probably costs less, but the average is 47 cents, so that someone from South Dakota can mail a letter into New York City, and that we have this communications across the whole country. And that's great. We accept that. It's the way it should be. What Mr. Izzo is saying is that if you do the same thing for electricity and you make it the same price to transmit electricity in from the middle of America to New Jersey as it would be to bring it in off the coastline of New Jersey, then that's going to undermine the economics of all the projects along the East Coast because it hasn't factored in how much it costs to transmit that electricity 1,500 miles all the way into the East Coast market. And so the question then becomes, how many new jobs will be created along the East Coast of the United States if there is no incentive any longer for Mr. Izzo because he's almost bound by his obligation to his shareholders to take all of this very inexpensive but subsidized electricity coming in from the Middle West. So how do we square this circle, Glenn, so that Mr. Izzo and Mr. Joes and others aren't disincentivized to produce renewable electricity within their own service areas?
Broad-based fair rates, that's basically what you're talking about. The people that are receiving the power, that are using the power, are paying the cost. That's what it really comes down to. If you're not talking about mailing that letter from the Dakotas to some other region of the country, and you're talking about instead what it costs to actually mail that letter to that location, that's the real issue that you're coming down to.
And Mr. Izzo, what would you respond to that?
So I would say that if I looked at just this last year alone, the price difference associated with transmitting power from the Plains states to New Jersey, depending upon how busy the transmission wires were, ranged from $20 to $80 a kilowatt hour. Typically, it was $30 to $40 a kilowatt hour. That means it would be cheaper for a customer in New Jersey to use a wind farm operating 25% of the time than to use a wind farm operating in the Plains 40% of the time, because it's the total cost that matters. If you eliminate transmission, then suddenly the 40% time of the Dakota farm looks cheaper, but you've put a burden on the American taxpayer and you've ended our economic development in our region.
Well, we want to be fair here, though, right? I mean, that's our goal of the bill. We want to incentivize renewable, this green energy revolution should be everywhere, not just in certain parts of the country. So we need to find a way then to make sure that we don't invoke this kind of consequence that undermines economic development in states that have incredible resources indigenous to them. And that's a real difficult problem here and something that we have to work through. I apologize to everyone. I really could spend a whole afternoon with you, and next week I might spend an afternoon with each one of you and working out this issue, because we have to be fair. We have to be fair. We have a big vision, but every state can actually play a role here. There is actually a role for everyone, and we have to make sure that we render to the East Coast the things that are theirs, the things to the South that are theirs, and the Midwest that are theirs, and the West that are theirs, the prairie, the desert. And Glenn, even as you were saying, you represent 75% of the land mass of the United States. There's an ocean mass, too, that is also out there, and we have to Excuse me? We do have coastal co-ops. No, that's what I'm saying to you. And so this whole... And so I want to make sure those coastal co-ops are able to go out into the ocean and have the incentive to... Excuse me? I'm with you. So we have to work out a fair formula. So I thank each of you, and we're going to have to stick very close together over the next couple of weeks so we can have this conversation and reflect what our national goals are, but with each state, each region, and the history of each state and region. States that aren't even states, they're commonwealths, whether it be Virginia or Massachusetts, have their own traditions in terms of what lands are sacred that might not follow the traditional Federal Lands Act, but have just the same impact in terms of the relationship with the history of our states. So I thank each of you, and I'm going to turn over the remainder of the hearing to Congresswoman Baldwin, who will bring it to a conclusion. Thank you so much.
And I don't get to sit in this chair very often, but I won't make you stay long, just because I'm enjoying it. First, a quick comment, and I'm not, I'm construing or interpreting from some of Mr. Welch's testimony that there's a frustration with some of the planning that's occurring at the state level process. And one of the things that I would just point out, and certainly we heard some testimony in the first panel about very successful state level planning, but if you look at Order 890 and this process, it's really relatively new, and I think I would argue hasn't been yet given the chance to play out. If you look at the area that I'm most familiar with, the first time MISO Order 890 planning processes were approved by FERC and then subject to additional compliance requirements was on May 15th, 2008. And thereafter, they had to do a filing in August of 2008, which was just approved on May 20th, 2009. So you could make an argument that really just 3 weeks ago this is getting underway, and it's a process that's to be given 12 to 24 months to occur. So it certainly concerns me to have a characterization of this state and regional planning processes as being broken or not working, when really much of the new focus is subject to Order 890 is just underway. I have one question for the panel with regard to it goes without saying that construction of a transmission superhighway will be a moneymaker for certain parties involved, and we heard the chairman of FERC testify about the economics of transmission siting and construction, as well as the guaranteed rate of return. And so I guess I'd like to ask you all, what role, if any, should these entities with profit interest play in the transmission siting and decision-making process? How should we appropriately limit or not the role that they play? And why don't we go from left to right this time and start with Mr. Miller?
Well, I appreciate that question. That's been one of the most troubling aspects of the planning process in the PJM region. The PJM is essentially, from our perspective, a trade association of utilities who are proposing projects and then ratifying the proposals amongst themselves. They do not have until very recently, have a process that complies with the FERC Order 890. They were looking only at transmission solutions and not at alternatives. And they do not do the kind of balancing of impacts, other issues of the public interest that state utility commissions more clearly have authority to do. So the current way we do regional transmission planning is very disturbing. The owners of the transmission lines propose projects. There's a reactive approval process, and there's no balancing of other considerations, even within the alternative energy solutions like energy efficiency DSM. They're starting to incorporate those things, but the process is very conservative and very oriented towards producing transmission solutions.
Mr. Welch?
Well, to go to your question first, the frustration that I feel with the planning process is I would agree with you that Order 890 went a long way. But the one thing that we don't have is in MISO or any of the other RTOs, we don't have full participation from all of the affected people. And as a result of that, when you're trying to do regional planning, you're not going to get to the solution set that you need. Number one. Number two, like when we had problems in 2003 with the largest blackout that affected this country, we finally came to the conclusion that NERC was funded improperly and wasn't independent in their decision-making for setting reliability standards. As a result of that, we changed the way NERC was funded. It reports to FERC. It's funded through an assessment through all the utilities. And that assessment is paid to FERC, who then pays NERC. And we've taken the financial incentives of the market participants out of the hands of the RTO, or in this case, the Reliability Council. So when we talk about independent planning, it's not about some kind of closed-door deal here. It's about getting the financial impacts off the back of the RTO so that they can do the job that they're there to do. Then when we get to that point, you have the question that says, hey, who should participate and what should be the rates of returns that these companies should earn? I think that the fair thing to say here is that, when you start to build regional projects that everyone's affected by, they should be all participating in as financial investors. This shouldn't be just a one-stop, one-person place, but those people should be part of that investment proposition because they are all there to make the grid work and work in a concert way. When you build a regional grid, you have to have yourself in a position where you can also maintain it. No one company could ever go across thousands of miles, have linemen, line crews, warehouse facilities, and everything that we need. And so it's going to take the participation of all of those people on the route. But without everyone being there at the table, this gets very tough to do. So when you get to that point, whatever FERC says is just and reasonable, that's what it'll be.
Mr. Dutchin.
Thank you for the question. Let me suggest a way to think about cost allocation and rate of return together. Under the current system, private companies enter into agreements to provide transmission, and they go out and they raise the capital on the markets to do that. So as regulators consider that, they have to provide the cost of that at the high cost of raising that capital, and then a rate of return on top of that. If the costs are more broadly shared, first of all, you have a guaranteed revenue flow, which will reduce the cost of capital to raise the money in the first place, and therefore a reduced rate of return to the companies would be justified. So there would be two ways by sharing the costs that you would reduce the cost of building out this transmission, sharing it across a broader range of customers.
Mr. English.
We've had many complaints about the fact that it's difficult for electric cooperatives to participate in this process, both because of the size and the complexity and the type of expertise is required to participate independently. But also, I think a lot of it does come down to this situation that the big entities of the region, quite frankly, are the ones that seem to have the control and the influence, or at least feel that they should. And many of those, so that basically does not have an all-inclusive, broad participation locally in designing many of the systems that come forward. So I think there's much work that needs to be done in the improvements in that, and hopefully we're going to see that in the future. But we need a broad-based planning system in place.
Mr. Nipper.
Yes, ma'am, we would agree with the comments that have been made that it really requires participation by everyone involved, all the stakeholders. That's varied in our members' views among regions, some a bit better than others, but it really is necessary that everyone be at the table and be participating, and that their input be accounted. I will say that, following up the comment on the RTO and ISO regions, and they vary a bit as well among them, but the opportunities to participate in the equally participate in the stakeholder process with some of the other stakeholders for our members leaves a lot to be desired. I'll say that. And then I would just lastly mention the benefits that I mentioned in my testimony about joint ownership. And if there are opportunities, equal opportunities for folks, and again, American Transmission Company is a good example of this, where an opportunity for broad and joint ownership by multiple entities provides planning and other benefits as well.
Thank you. Mr. Jost.
Well, I might just pick up on something Mr. Miller said. I think that FERC's incentive policies have created a situation where not only independent transmission companies but integrated utilities that hold distribution, transmission, and generation favor investment in transmission for solutions to the problems, even if they're not the most optimum solution, because frankly the rates of return are higher and the level of risk are significantly lower than other kinds of investments that might be under state regulatory policy, for example, vis-a-vis what the FERC has put in place. So our concern is you see a rush to invest in transmission. Now, I want to clarify again, there are transmission projects that make sense, and if they make good economic sense, they ought to be supported. I think we have to be careful not to incent investment because of the low-risk, high-return environment vis-a-vis the public interest, and therefore I do think broad public planning of some nature is necessary with broad participation.
Thank you. And Mr. Izzo.
We operate both a regulated transmission and distribution business and an unregulated generation business. And the regulated transmission business provides reliability 99.999% of the times through a regional planning process. It works, and it works well. And that is regulated, and rates are based upon our cost of service. Our unregulated generation business always has to consider the cost of connecting to the grid as part of its investment strategy and fully bears that cost. We need to dispel the notion that renewables are not being built because of the transmission system. Renewables are not being built because we're not sending clear price signals. This committee deserves congratulations on doing that through cap and trade and through setting an RES. And now, at the risk of being a little flip, the next thing I expect to hear from people is that if only we had refrigerated freight trains running free of charge from the North Pole, our local supermarket would get its ice cubes from there. It just doesn't make sense to ignore the transportation charges.
I want to thank all of you gentlemen again for your time and expertise and your patience. Before I adjourn, I need to ask unanimous consent that 2 letters from FERC to Chairman Markey are put in the record without objection, so ordered. And with that, our hearing is adjourned.